Hey everybody, it's been a minute since I was able to work on this personal project. I have a lot of stuff going on outside of animation that required a lot of my attention, but we're back and we're looking at the second melee hit with Raphael. So if you recall, I use a piece of the reference as inspiration for this melee hit. I ended up shooting a play blast of various points throughout this animation process. So we're going to walk through those. The stages, they're a little bit arbitrary. Some days I can only work for a few minutes after work, and that's how far I got. And sometimes I have an entire afternoon to myself and I can block it out. So it's not necessarily indicative of like, here's how long each stage should take. It's just sort of where I got to on each day. So first, blocking. This stage has one purpose: get something into engine that roughly represents the animation, extremely roughly. So a lot of animators will block in stepped, and that's fine, but I feel like spline gives me more information about speed and interpolation, how it feels to the player. And it allows me, I think, to make decisions on the fly and plan ahead for issues that may come up. So video number one, that's what this is. You'll see it doesn't have basically anything that would make it a quote unquote good animation, and that's okay. Essentially, this was me putting the legs into cog space so that they followed the torso. Mark Masters actually does a great job of breaking down this process in a video that I'll try to find the link to and put in the description. But the short version is bake the legs, the IK legs onto locators, switch the space, and bake it back onto the locators. So after this, I pretty much only animated the cog and the root controls so that Raphael kind of sort of maybe face the directions he was supposed to ish. Second video. So this is a little bit later. One thing I noticed in the first video was the interminably long time it took for me to get back into idle. That's not a conscious decision I made on my part in the first one. I just kind of made up that I knew I was going to have to make up this transition back into idle because the reference doesn't include it. And I basically just pasted the idle pose at an arbitrary point at the end, and it ended up being way too long. So players don't want to sit around for forever for the next thing to happen. And it's just a lot of, it'd take a really long time to turn around. So that was the first change to make. It's not the most important one to the animation, but it's certainly something that it was just bugging me. I also made overall changes to the timing to closer match the reference. We still don't have any arm animation. We have some really basic foot poses. I kind of hesitate to call them poses. Even if they aren't, they're not very strong, at least they're in. At the end of this, I'm starting to notice just how weird and awkward that turn back into idle is. Something I'm going to have to figure out at this point. Like, is it going to turn left? Is it going to turn right? How many steps am I taking? Is it like, would it be faster to flip into idle, something crazy acrobatic? And I decided, well, that would be something I would work on the next time I got to work on it. So here's video 3. Now you can see that we're really getting somewhere. We have actual kicks instead of like weird poses. The arms are kind of sort of involved, and the transition to idle is way more natural. So it's around this point I decide like, okay, this is working. I'm going to focus on tracking the head and torso more because keeping nice arcs on those is really going to help a lot with this one. There's a lot going on, twisting and kicking. And as we twist and we rotate, you need something to focus on. If the player's all over the place, or the character's all over the place, you're not going to be able to kind of realize what's happening. But doing this, led me to discover a problem. I've been so focused at that point on just working in perspective view that I kind of neglected the camera view, really what in my little setup the player would be experiencing. Now, if this was a side scroller, awesome, that would be great, but it's not, the way I've set it up in Unreal is not as a side scroller. So the legs and the kicks are really barely visible in this. And I thought that that's a real problem. So it was a combination of things of maybe not jumping up as high, and rotating the entire, animation a little bit so that the legs are kind of more visible. But then I realized I need to sell this more with the torso and the head and the arms switching poses as she gets into this awesome, in the reference, this awesome like second kick pose. So I needed to utilize those things to sort of sell this a bit more. There's also a really kind of a weird speed up in the translate forward that's super noticeable in this animation. And that's just me, trying to track the head and the chest in some areas and then not compensating for that, later on as we go back into idle. So here's the fourth video. We are really cooking now. This is where we start breaking things. The basic motion is in here, but things like really squashing and stretching the controls to extremes is going to be really messy, trial and error. You don't want to do it at the very beginning. So here, most of those changes are in the IK chest, the cog control, the head control. We definitely do that in order to make Raphael smaller in his windup and his anticipation to the big kick, the second kick, because he has a really blocky torso and it's sort of hard to get reverse shapes in there as much as we tried to put it in. And the better way to do that was to get compact and then stretch out. But obviously, the more noticeable one that I did this to was in the legs. Those legs, I actually ended up switching to FK. It spends so much time in the air, it just makes it easier. I actually did the same process where they were in local space. The FK legs were in local space, baked them to locator, switched them to world, and then went about animating them. So definitely stretched out the legs. They have a stretch component on. I think that's like that the elbow control for the legs. That really, really helped for the kicks. And I also went about kind of adding more of a bounce and a settle in the return to the idle, but something I'm happy with it, but something was still missing. So here's video 5. And the thing that I was missing was timing. So I kind of, was still sticking to the timing of the reference, and I didn't actually make a huge change here. I probably could have gone further with it. I took all of the animation and I threw it into the time editor, which I love. I love this tool. It's really similar to me to Motion Builder's kind of story mode. It's not as robust, but it's close. So it allows you to edit your timing really quickly and bake it back into the scene. It's a little bit messy. It doesn't bake onto whole frames, so it's really best to be smart about it. If you use it really early on, you make those keys whole again so that, all your, if you're keying the entire body, you're keeping those on the same frame and they're not on subframes. So if you do it later on in the polish stage, you want to make sure that weirdness isn't happening on subframes if you're not going to bake it back. But more importantly, you want to make sure that you aren't losing key poses that you've built that were on whole frames. If you're squashing and stretching the timing, you have the potential to lose those. Those poses will be there, but they'll be a little bit different than the way you originally set them up. And if you're making deliberate decisions, stick with them. If you get some happy accident, then great, but that's probably not going to happen. Beyond that, there's a lot of little stuff that I ended up fixing. I manipulated the head and the torso on ones in some areas to make them track a little bit better. But overall, this is just an exercise, and I'm not going to take it to a very high polish stage. We've kind of accomplished what we set out to do. I do have notes for it still. If I were to continue with it, I still don't like the takeoff. We don't get the stretched leg that's in the reference, and Raphael's head is kind of popping a bit back and forth. Overall, the shell and size just make it really difficult to get shape changes. So I just wanted to get into the action, into the kicks as quickly as possible. One last thing that I wanted to do was show you what it looks like in game, especially combined with the previous hit. And this worked out really well. I want to say weirdly, but it worked. It works well in either order, which is not how I designed it. The starting pose of this is the first pose the starting pose of this is the last pose in the first melee hit, but it works out, as you can see here, fine in either order. And I'm sure that that's something that in a professional setting, I'm going to want to clearly determine with design, like how is the player going to control this character? Can they mash buttons? Can this hit come after this hit? Like, is there a specific order? You can see me hitting the double kick multiple times in a row. I don't think that would, it doesn't quite work, but from the player perspective, it didn't feel that bad. So for now, for the purposes of this thing, it's fine. This is successful. So I really hope that this was helpful. I had so much fun making this. I'm really sorry that it took so long to finish. It's been at least a couple of weeks. I don't plan on continuing a lot more with the Raphael character. I think I got what I was looking to do out of it. But I really love doing these videos, and it makes me a better animator when I have to explain and justify what I'm doing. So maybe another rig in, the future we'll get a series.